Nehemiah was a man that God had chosen. Nehemiah was God's man, and God's men are men that initiate. As a father, the responsibility to initiate is on us. To initiate prayer around the dinner table. To initiate that we all go to church together. To initiate the halting of an argument that may be occurring. To initiate healing within our marriage. To initiate the growing of God's kingdom. It is God's man and his responsibility to be an initiator. And not just it'll just happen when it happens. Not to be apathetic, but to initiate. Nehemiah initiated by wearing his heart on his sleeve. You know, a lot of men do not like to wear their heart on their sleeve, but some men just can't help it. I'm one of those guys. You know when I'm angry, you know when I'm happy, you know when I'm sad. I just wear my emotions on my sleeve. I don't hold back. I'm not that political. If I'm upset about something, you kind of know that I'm upset. It's just how I do. A lot of men classify wearing your emotions on your sleeve as something weak. But what we see here with Nehemiah is that it was a strength and it was a way that he initiated conversation with the king. Nehemiah was a cupbearer for the king. Nehemiah had been seen by the king. The king knew Nehemiah. And the king said, look, there's something wrong with your face. You got this ill look about you. And it's not a sickness, it's a sadness about you. This wearing your emotion on your sleeve, Nehemiah, I've picked up on, and you don't seem like you're in the right sorts. What's going on? Nehemiah initiated by wearing his heart on his sleeve. He also initiated by appealing to pity. Persians at this time were paranoid about their respect for the dead and proper burial rites. And what we see in verse 3, he says, I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tomb, by the way, and its gates have been consumed by fire? Nehemiah was not unintelligent. Nehemiah was not ill-prepared. Nehemiah was prepared for a conversation. He knew the king had superstition. He knew the king was paranoid about burial rites and the dead. And so whenever he threw that, the place of my father's tomb is desolate, he knew that would strike an emotional chord with the king. Is that fair? She would strike an emotional chord with the king? Well, see, as a father, the one thing we got to realize is for the safety, the spiritual growth of our family, church family, or our immediate family, we got to do whatever we can to protect our family. Was it unfair? Was it sissy-like to appeal to pity and his emotion? Who cares? It was a way that he was able to go back to his father's land and be able to rebuild it. No matter what it took, he was the man that was going to do whatever it took to do what God had called him to do. Even if that meant appealing to pity to this Persian king. Nehemiah also initiates by using selective words. He wasn't some basket case that just poured it all out on the line. He didn't show like his whole deck of cards in his hands. He didn't show everything to the king. He avoided mentioning the name Jerusalem, if you notice. He just said the place of my father, and the king knew it was Jerusalem, but he didn't say Jerusalem. And the reason being is because the name would have reminded the king of his earlier investigation throughout Jerusalem. It would have been a word that would have struck a chord with the king. And so he chose his words wisely. He didn't just go all out and whatever happens, it happens and I have to deal with it. He was very intentional on how he spoke to the one that had the power to change things. In today's world, we're not too much like that, are we? Mind filters really kind of go out the abyss. I mean, we get mad at work, we go home and blast them out on Facebook. Which, by the way, let me tell you, if you ever try to get another job, they're going to look at your Facebook wall. They're going to look at your Facebook wall. I know many men in ministry that have tried to get a church, but were told not or fired from their church because of horrible things they put on Facebook about their previous church. You've got to be a man. You You got to be a gentleman that knows what to say, when to say, how to say. Doesn't mean being a pushover. He wasn't a pushover, but he was selective. He was strategic. God's man understands and accepts his responsibility. God's man understands that no one else will take care of it unless he stands and does it. Your family, for example, nobody else is going to take care of your family. You have got to stand and do that. Nobody else is going to take care of your family epiphany unless you stand and do it. God's man understands this. God's man initiates when protecting his family. We've got a video about a first-time dad. Nehemiah formulating the plan. In verse 11, we see this real specifically. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I rose at night, and a few men were with me. I didn't tell anyone that my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem. And there was no animal with me except the animal that I was riding on. So I went out by night in the valley gate, in the direction of the dragon's well, onto the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem. Planning, preparing, looking, which were broken down, and its gates were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up by night by the ravine to inspect the wall, and then I entered the valley gate again and returned. What we see is that Nehemiah was formulating a plan. He formulates a plan at night when there's nobody else around to nose around. Because it wasn't anybody else's business. He had to do it. He wanted to formulate it. He only had a couple of very trusted people that were with him, but he didn't want to do it in the daylight when all the city officials or when everybody else would have been poking and probing, trying to figure out all this kind of stuff. He did it at night, so he could be left alone, so he could formulate a plan and not have any kind of distraction. And because Nehemiah had formulated a plan then, we also see Nehemiah formulating a plan in chapter 1. And because he formulated that plan in chapter 1, he arrived to Jerusalem in style. In style. See, it wasn't just Nehemiah and just a couple of his boys going to Jerusalem. He was being led and being surrounded by an entire Persian army. And anybody from where he was to Jerusalem, anybody that was in the way, anybody that was of any notoriety, he had letters from the king to them to let Nehemiah pass on through. Nehemiah did not only just arrive, he arrived in style. Why? Because he had a plan. Too many times do we often just say, I got this idea, I'm going to do it right now. Boom, and we go. And we don't develop a plan at all. Sometimes it works okay, but what we see here with Nehemiah planning and praying for 4 months, his plan was huge. His task was huge. He didn't just fly off the seat of his pants. And sometimes with our families, answers don't come overnight. Solving our marital issues don't just solve in a 30-minute counseling session. Sometimes it takes time and prayer and hard work to get out by yourself. Just to be out with you and the Lord to investigate what's going on. And then to come back to people and say, okay, this is what the Lord has told me. Nehemiah's plan included 3 steps. Most plans have 3 steps. To get your family back on track, you'll have to use these 3 steps. First, identify the need. What's the need of your family? What's the need of your church? Nehemiah called their attention to the obvious. Jerusalem was desolate. No brainer. He called them to the obvious. That was the need. That was the first step, find the need. The second step is to define the goal. You see a need, what's the goal? He urged them to rebuild the wall so God's people would no longer be an reproach among other nations. So other nations could not just come and take them. And that was the goal. The wall needed to be up for their protection. Here's the need. It's desolate. The goal, rebuild the wall for protection. The third aspect of the plan was to define the method. You got a need. That's the starting point. You got a goal. That's the finish. That's where we're headed. What's the method to get there? The method for them was encouragement. By testifying how God and King Artaxerxes had favorably disposed of him, had helped him. He was encouraging the troops. He was encouraging the people around him. And he used everybody that was willing to work to be a part of whatever task. So his method was encouraging, but even more specific. He had little bitty jobs lined out for everybody involved to get the goal accomplished. You have a game plan, men. See, most men do have game plans. For example, myself. I have a game plan for no matter where I'm at. If I'm attacked by a team of ninja, I know what to do. I know how to do it. I know where to go. If I have my family with me, I've already got it all mapped out. Some of you may be like, "Man, that's kind of silly." That's how my mind works. If I am at a mall, I'm going to try to take my wife somewhere this week to eat somewhere. And if we're in a restaurant, I'm going to have in my mind, okay, if ninja jump out of the ceiling right now, what do I do? What do I do? You've got to be prepared. Why is it that men don't sit in a restaurant with their back to the door? Because if somebody comes busting in, they want to see it and take charge. Men have game plans. But do you have the right kind of game plan? Do you have a game plan for the spiritual growth of your family? How's your children going to grow? How's your wife going to grow? How are you going to grow? How's your marriage going to grow? Do you have a game plan? Or is it just like, well, we kind of go to church and I think it'll work out? If you aim at nothing, then you will hit anything. I'm not sure about you, but being a dad, I don't want my kids to become anything. I want them to become God-fearing, God-loving, God-serving. And if that's my goal, I need to identify the needs of my daughter's and my son's life and then define a method on how we're going to get them there. Because between now and the age of 18, it's my job. They get 18, they can be as crazy as they want to be. I hope they're not. Still going to have to honor me. I'm going to be bigger than they are. God's man is the man that does the job. A father does the job. You initiate, you got a plan, but you also do the job. You don't just sit back and bark orders at the wife saying, "Here's my plan from on high. I have them written on stone tablets, and now you must do them. I'm going to put them on the kitchen table now because they're heavy." It's not what men or fathers are going to do. We are to say, "There's a plan, here's my job. It's twice as much as everybody else's job because I'm going to ask y'all for some tough stuff. And mine is twice as hard as yours because I'm the dad." But the dad has got to do the job. There will be people hanging around all the time, as we see in verse 19, but they don't want to have any part of it. Friends, so-called friends, naysayers. Isn't it always the people that are financially poor that always try to get financial answers? Ever notice that? The same thing is true with everything else. And those that have the horrible marriages always have the first opinion. Always. You can't let everybody else play your game. It's your job. You got to play it, and you got to be smart on how you play it. God's man is a man that does the job. Dad